Chapter 1. Introduction. 1.1. Historical context. Europe in the 11th century. The 11th century in Europe was an era of dynamic transformation in religious, social, and political life. The continent emerged from the early medieval period with new vitality. Population growth accelerated after the year 1000. Agricultural expansion and economic revival were underway, and more centralized forms of governance began to develop in several feudal kingdoms. Western Christendom, though still fragmented and relatively backward compared to Byzantine or Islamic civilizations, was becoming a significant power by the century's end. This growing confidence set the stage for ambitious enterprises, including large-scale religious wars that would have been unimaginable in earlier centuries. Crucially, the Latin Church underwent a far-reaching reform movement that reshaped the religious landscape of Europe. In the wake of scandals and secular entanglements in the 10th-11th centuries, a series of reformist popes and clerics, often associated with the Cluniac monastic revival and culminating in the Gregorian reform under Pope Gregory XVII, sought to purify the Church and affirm its authority over secular rulers. These reforms attacked simony, the buying of church offices, and clerical corruption, enforced clerical celibacy, and asserted papal primacy even over emperors. By the 1080s, Pope Gregory was locked in a dramatic conflict with the German Emperor Henry IV over lay investiture. Gregory framed this clash in cosmic terms. He reportedly saw his struggle against imperial opponents as an apocalyptic battle between the forces of the true church and the forces of Antichrist. Indeed, Gregory likened Henry's supporters to the biblical Gog and Magog, invoking imagery from the Book of Revelation in his correspondence. Such rhetoric reveals how deeply the reformers' mindset was imbued with eschatological urgency. The Reform Party believed they were renewing a church that had grown worldly, perhaps even preparing it for the final trials of history. At the same time, ordinary Christians were experiencing a rich and emotional religious life, often marked by intense displays of devotion. Popular piety in the 11th century was stirred by tales of signs and wonders, and people readily interpreted natural disasters or celestial phenomena as portents of divine intervention. This was an age when a meteor shower or a comet might be seen as an omen announcing extraordinary events. The chronicler Orderic Vitalis, for example, records that a great comet in 1066 was viewed with dread as foreshadowing calamities. Such a mindset, inclined to see the supernatural in daily events, meant that apocalyptic expectations could easily take root among the populace when historical circumstances seemed to align with biblical prophecy. One pivotal question long asked by historians is whether Europeans around the millennial date of 1000 AD were gripped by collective apocalyptic panic. Did the majority of people in Western Europe await the night of December 31st, 999 with bated breath, convinced that Christ might return in glory at midnight, or that the prophesied 1,000-year reign of the saints, Revelation 21-6, would commence with the dawn of the new millennium? Modern scholarship tends to answer this question with caution. Contemporary evidence for mass millenarian enthusiasm around 1000 is limited and ambiguous. A few written sources from the time do indicate heightened eschatological interest. The monk Abbo of Fleury recalls a preacher in Paris claiming that the Antichrist would arrive in the year 1000, and in England, Archbishop Wulfstan of York delivered fiery sermons, such as Sermo Lupiat Anglos, warning that the end of the world was near, drawing on the turmoil of Viking invasions as evidence that Satan had been loosed for a time. Perhaps the most famous chronicler of the age, Rodulfus Glaber, wrote that in the years after 1000 AD, it was as if a white mantle of churches spread over Europe, a wave of church building that he and later readers have associated with millennial enthusiasm. These scattered references show that apocalyptic expectation did exist in the 10th and early 11th centuries. Yet it is doubtful that there was a universally shared popular panic about the year 1000 itself. Historians now emphasize that the notion of a sharp divide between an educated clergy, supposedly dismissive of apocalyptic chronology, and a credulous laity is misleading. In reality, most written accounts of the millennium come from monks and clerics who were themselves influenced by the long tradition of Christian eschatology. These churchmen, especially in the Latin West, largely followed the moderating guidance of St. Augustine and St. Bede, who taught that the exact time of the end was unknowable and cautioned against millennial date setting. Thus, while there were localized surges of apocalyptic fear or excitement around 1000, and again around 1033, the millennial anniversary of Christ's Passion, there is little evidence of a pan-European millenarian movement at the turn of the millennium. Rather, what we see in surviving sources is a persistent undercurrent of apocalyptic belief that could flare up under certain conditions, a mindset ready to see signs of the end in unusual events without an agreed timetable. Whether or not the year 1000 itself caused widespread panic, the decades that followed witnessed profound efforts to reform society in accordance with Christian principles, which some historians link to a millennial spirit. The Peace of God, Pax Dei movement, for instance, arose in late 10th century and early 11th century France as a church-led attempt to curb the endemic violence of feudal warfare. Beginning with church councils at Le Puy circa 975 and Cherbourg 989, bishops, abbots, and lay crowds gathered in fields, invoked the protection of saints' relics, and swore oaths to restrain the nobility from attacking non-combatants, clergy, peasants, women, and other defenseless persons. Soon the movement expanded into the Truce of God, Trêve Dei, which prohibited fighting on certain days of the week and during sacred seasons. These initiatives, supported by popular enthusiasm, were novel attempts to Christianize the knightly aristocracy's conduct. They reveal a society grappling with the disparity between the ideals of Christian peace and the reality of chronic violence. Some scholars, notably Richard Landis, have suggested that the peace of God was fueled by apocalyptic expectations, that contemporaries believed establishing social peace was necessary preparation for Christ's impending kingdom. Indeed, the councils often carried an air of urgent piety, as if the very act of gathering the faithful under the gaze of holy relics to swear peace had cosmic import. Whether or not the movement was explicitly millenarian, it certainly reflects the moral reformism that characterized this era. By the late 11th century, therefore, Latin Christendom was marked by a curious blend of piety and militancy. On one hand, there was heightened religious enthusiasm. Lay people flocked to hear itinerant preachers, venerated saints' shrines, and embraced calls for moral reform. On the other hand, that same enthusiasm could be channeled into aggressive causes sanctioned by the Church. Nowhere was this more evident than at the Council of Clermont in 1095. At Clermont, Pope Urban II not only reaffirmed the peace of God, urging Christian knights to cease killing their neighbors, but in almost the same breath he proclaimed a new holy war to liberate the Eastern Christians in the holy city of Jerusalem. It might seem paradoxical that an ecclesiastical council would both promulgate peace and authorize war. Yet in the eyes of Urban II and his audience, there was no contradiction. The peace decrees protected the innocent at home, while the holy war offered a means for violent men to redeem themselves by defending the innocent abroad. War undertaken to defend Christ's realm and aid fellow Christians was now framed not as sin, but as penitential labor pleasing to God. This creative fusion of ideals, peace at home, holy war abroad, epitomizes the 11th century mindset and forms the immediate backdrop for the First Crusade. Also critical to 11th century context was Western Europe's growing engagement with the outside world. The Spanish Reconquista was already underway in Iberia, where Christian knights from Spain and even distant France fought to reclaim territory from Muslim rulers in campaigns often blessed by the Church. In the East, the once remote Byzantine Empire came sharply into Western focus after the catastrophic Battle of Manzikert in 1071, where the Eastern Emperor was defeated and large parts of Asia Minor fell to the Seljuk Turks. Reports filtered west of Christian pilgrimage routes becoming dangerous or impassable, of the holy city of Jerusalem itself, under Fatimid Muslim control, being increasingly difficult for devout pilgrims to reach. In 1195, Emperor Alexios I Komnenos of Byzantium urgently appealed to Pope Urban II for military assistance against the encroaching Turks. This plea came at a fortuitous moment. Not only had relations between the Roman papacy and the Byzantine Church slightly warmed after the schism of 1054, but the Latin West now possessed both the ideological will and the organizational capacity to respond vigorously. Urban II, a French pope steeped in reformist zeal, saw in Alexius's call an opportunity to assert papal leadership on a grand stage, to heal the East-West rift, and perhaps to unite Christendom against a common foe. His summons to crusade would tap into all the currents we have identified: penitential warfare, knightly piety, pilgrimage devotion, and apocalyptic imagination, to launch an unprecedented armed pilgrimage to the East. In sum, Europe in the 11th century was a society abounding in energy and confidence, as well as in religious enthusiasm and expectation. A surge of reforming spirituality had coincided with the emergence of more powerful ecclesiastical and secular institutions. The result was that, by the century's close, Latin Christians were prepared to undertake something radically new: the Crusade. Understanding this historical context, the mingling of apocalyptic hopes with crusading ideals, is essential for grasping why thousands took up the cross in 1095 and why they invested that venture with ultimate meaning. The First Crusade did not arise in a vacuum. It was the product of its age's deep anxieties and grand aspirations. 1.2. Defining apocalyptic eschatology. To analyze the intersection of apocalyptic thought and the crusading ideal, we must first clarify what we mean by apocalyptic eschatology. Eschatology in Christian theology refers to the doctrine of the last things, the events at the end of history, including the second coming of Christ, the final judgment, the resurrection of the dead, and the ultimate fate of souls. It encompasses beliefs about heaven and hell, the fulfillment of God's plan for salvation, and the consummation of the world. Apocalyptic eschatology is a specific mode of eschatological expectation, one characterized by the unveiling. Apocalypsis in Greek means revelation, or unveiling, of divine mysteries concerning the end times, often through vivid prophetic visions and symbolism. It typically anticipates an imminent and radical transformation of the world, involving cosmic catastrophe and divine intervention to destroy evil and inaugurate a new age of righteousness. In short, apocalypticism expects not just the eventual end of the world, as classic Christian doctrine holds, but sees the end as imminent and usually accompanied by tumultuous events in a new heavenly order replacing the old world. The roots of Christian apocalyptic eschatology lie in Scripture. Early Christians inherited Jewish apocalyptic traditions found in texts like the Book of Daniel and the intertestamental apocalypses, and these were further developed in the New Testament, most famously in the Book of Revelation, the Apocalypse of John. Revelation presents a dramatic prophetic tableau of the end: wars, plagues, the rise of monstrous beasts symbolizing evil empires, the persecution of the faithful, and ultimately the triumphant return of Christ, the defeat of Satan and the Antichrist, a 1,000-year reign of Christ and the saints, the millennium, and the coming of a new Jerusalem from heaven. This scriptural foundation meant that apocalyptic ideas were never far from Christian thought. However, the interpretation and emphasis on these ideas have varied greatly over time. In the early church, there was a range of eschatological viewpoints. Some 1st and 2nd century Christians expected Christ's return in the very near future. As time went on and the anticipated second coming tarried, Christian theologians developed more nuanced eschatologies. By the 4th and 5th centuries, one towering figure, St. Augustine of Hippo, 354 to 430, decisively shaped Western eschatological thinking. Augustine's mature view, especially as articulated in his monumental work, The City of God, was essentially amillennial, a term used later to describe his position. He argued against a literal interpretation of the 1,000 years of Revelation 20. Following an earlier theologian, Tychonius, Augustine taught that the millennium had already begun with Christ's first coming and was in effect the current era of the church. In Augustine's exegesis, the prophecies of Revelation were to be read allegorically as depicting the ongoing spiritual struggle between the city of God and the earthly city of the devil, rather than a concrete timetable of future history. The first resurrection, revelation. 25 he interpreted as the spiritual rebirth of souls in Christ, and the binding of Satan for 1,000 years as a figurative depiction of the church era during which the gospel restrains evil to some degree. The reign of the saints, therefore, was not a literal future golden age on earth, but the present reality of the church itself, mixed with tribulation. For Augustine, the key unknown was the date of the second coming, which he insisted no one could know, citing Christ's words that, "Of that day and hour no one knows," Matthew 24:36. History would last until the number of the elect was fulfilled. Only then would Christ return for the final judgment. Augustine's influence on Latin Christianity cannot be overstated. His skeptical stance towards chiliastic, millenarian speculation set the tone for Orthodox theology throughout the Middle Ages. Expectations of an imminent, datable end of the world were officially discouraged, and millennialist movements were viewed with suspicion by church authorities, at least after the fact. The apocalypse was largely interpreted through an allegorical or spiritual lens in mainstream exegesis, emphasizing moral and ecclesiological readings rather than literal futuristic ones. Medieval scholars like the Venerable Bede, circa 673 to 735, followed Augustine's lead. Bede even revised world chronology, calculating that Christ was born in the year 3952 of the world, to avoid any suggestion that the biblical 6 ages of history were nearing their end. His scheme implied the 6th age, the final age of history before eternity, would not terminate until the world reached about 7,000 years of age, far in the future. Both Augustine and Bede repeatedly affirmed that the exact timing of the end was known only to God, thus gently dissuading the faithful from apocalyptic date-mongering. Yet even as the official theological line trod cautiously, apocalyptic eschatology continued to fascinate and inspire. It is helpful here to distinguish types of apocalyptic expectation. Scholars of millenarian movements, such as Norman Cohn and others, have delineated 2 broad categories: reformist apocalypticism versus radical or millenarian apocalypticism. Reformist or gradualist apocalyptic thinkers expect an imminent transformative intervention by God that nonetheless works within the current historical framework. They hope for the renewal or purification of society and the church, essentially a thorough reform, rather than the complete annihilation of the existing world. The 12th century abbot Joachim of Fiore, though beyond our present 11th century focus, is often cited as a prime example. Joachim envisioned the dawning of a new spiritual age, an age of the Holy Spirit, on earth, a kind of Sabbath age of peace and enlightenment before the end, rather than the immediate appearance of Christ in glory. In contrast, radical or millenarian movements typically look for an abrupt, total overthrow of the present order and its replacement by a new divine order, often conceived as a literal millennium, 1,000-year golden age, of collective happiness on earth, preceding or culminating in Christ's return. Such millenarian sects, as Cohn famously observed, characteristically promise salvation that is collective for the group of true believers, terrestrial to be enjoyed in this world, not just in heaven, imminent, total, completely transforming life, and achieved through miraculous means. In practice, reformist and radical apocalyptic ideals could blur, but this distinction helps us understand medieval phenomena. The mainstream church in the 11th century could countenance a reformist apocalyptic mood. For instance, hopes that a reformed papacy and a united Christendom might inaugurate a new era of Christian victory, while remaining hostile to any radical prophets or sects that tried to force the end through rebellion or that preached doctrinal deviance. Medieval Latin Europe produced a number of prophecies and legends that kept apocalyptic hopes alive at the popular level, even as learned theologians hewed to Augustine. One of the most pervasive was the legend of the last world emperor, or last Roman emperor. This myth, which first emerged in the East in the 7th century apocalypse of Pseudo-Methodius, foretold that a great Christian monarch would arise in the final days. This last emperor would reunite the Roman Empire, vanquish the forces of unbelief, notably in Pseudo-Methodius's context, the invading forces of Islam, and restore a universal Christian peace. At the end of his reign, he would journey to Jerusalem, lay down his crown on the Mount of Olives, and relinquish all power to God, at which point the Antichrist would appear, ushering in the final conflict. The legend was widely transmitted in the Latin West. An influential 10th century abbot, Adso of Montier wrote a popular treatise, De Ortu et Tempore Antichristi, on the origin and time of Antichrist, as a letter to Queen Gerberga of France. Adso incorporated the last emperor motif, specifying that this final divine monarch would be of the Frankish royal line, implicitly connecting it to Gerberga's husband's Carolingian heritage. According to Adso, the last Frankish emperor would conquer all the enemies of Christ, bring about a time of great prosperity for the church, and then retire to Jerusalem, thus setting the stage for Antichrist's advent in the end of days. This prophecy elegantly linked the destiny of Latin Christendom, the Franks, with the grand drama of the Apocalypse. It also cast eschatological significance on the city of Jerusalem, which was to be the focal point of final events. The figure of Antichrist himself also loomed large in medieval imagination. Christian eschatology from Scripture foretold a powerful deceiver who would come in the last days, an anti-Messiah leading a pseudo-church and persecuting the faithful, before being slain by Christ. Adso's letter systematized the medieval legend of Antichrist. He would be a Jew born in Babylon, raised in miracles, declaring himself to be God and ruling from Jerusalem for a short time, before Christ defeats him. Manuscripts of Adso's libellus spread widely, becoming the standard Antichrist doctrine in Europe for centuries. Such material shows that, despite an absence of official apocalyptic dogma, the basic narrative framework of the end times, with characters like Antichrist and the last emperor, was well known to clergy and laity. This narrative could be invoked whenever historical events seemed to align. For example, by the late 11th century, some chroniclers identified contemporary leaders or enemies with apocalyptic figures. A few would soon wonder, for instance, if Emperor Henry IV, excommunicated and at odds with the papacy, might be an Antichrist figure, or conversely, whether Pope Gregory VII was himself the Antichrist as imperial partisans alleged in propaganda. Apocalyptic language provided medieval people a way to decode history's turmoil as part of God's providential script. In sum, apocalyptic eschatology in 11th century Europe was a complex tapestry. Theologically, the Church maintained an Augustinian caution. No one should presume to know the date of Christ's return or set up a literal earthly utopia. Socially and culturally, however, apocalyptic ideas were very much in the air, available to inspire hope or dread. They could energize movements for moral reform and embolden leaders who fancied themselves agents of divine destiny. They could also incite radical actions on the fringes. Whenever extreme stress or exhilaration gripped society, be it fear of invasion, signs in the sky, or the excitement of a holy war, latent apocalyptic expectations tended to surface. As we shall see, the era of the First Crusade was precisely such a time of excitement and stress, when the symbols and language of apocalypse became potent tools for interpretation and motivation. 1.3. The Crusading Ideal. Origins and Interpretations. The Crusading ideal was a novel synthesis of earlier Christian concepts, most prominently the pilgrimage and the just holy war, forged in the late 11th century under the leadership of a reformist papacy. It arose from the conviction that fighting, when done for sacred purposes under the authority of the Church, could be not only justifiable, but meritorious. The origins of this idea can be traced through incremental developments in church practice and theology, even before Pope Urban II's dramatic call to arms in 1095. One important root was the long-established tradition of pilgrimage to holy shrines. Since the early Christian centuries, the faithful had undertaken arduous journeys to places sanctified by Christ and the saints. By the 11th century, three great pilgrimage destinations stood out: Rome, site of the tombs of Apostles Peter and Paul; Santiago de Compostela in Spain, shrine of St. James; and above all, Jerusalem, which housed the Church of the Holy Sepulchre on the site of Jesus' burial and resurrection. Pilgrimage was seen as an act of devotion and also of penance, a way to expiate sins through physical hardship and pious exercise. It was not uncommon for confessors to prescribe a pilgrimage as a penance for grave sin. Thus, by the late 11th century, Europeans were well acquainted with the notion of traveling for the sake of God, enduring trials en route to a sacred goal, and earning spiritual benefit thereby. Another root of crusading was the Church's evolving stance on warfare. Christianity's foundational ethic is one of peace, yet the religion had, from the time of St. Augustine onward, developed a doctrine of just war. Augustine himself, confronting the realities of a Christian empire that needed defending, argued that war could be just and even required in certain circumstances, namely if waged under legitimate authority for a righteous cause, such as defending against aggression or correcting injustice, and with the right intentions, seeking peace, not revenge or conquest. 2. Throughout the early Middle Ages, this just war theory provided moral criteria for Christian rulers like Charlemagne to conduct wars without imperiling their souls. What changed by the 11th century was the willingness of the church hierarchy, popes and bishops, to actively promote and direct warfare in defense of the faith. Earlier popes had occasionally encouraged wars on the church's behalf. For example, Pope John VIII in the 9th century urged Frankish rulers to fight the Muslim raiders threatening Italy, and Pope Alexander II in 1063 gave his blessing and a sort of indulgence to knights battling Muslims in Spain. These precedents foreshadowed the crusading idea by framing military action against non-Christians as a holy endeavor. The Gregorian reformers further sanctified the notion of militia Christi, the knighthood of Christ. Gregory VII himself, in 1074, conceived a plan to lead a host of armed pilgrims to aid the Greek Christians after Manzikert, referring to his potential warriors as soldiers of St. Peter. Although Gregory's expedition never materialized due to the investiture controversy, the concept was in place. The Pope could summon Christendom's warriors to fight for a sacred cause. In church reform ideology, the knightly aristocracy, so often condemned for their violence, could find redemption by turning their swords against the enemies of God instead of their fellow Christians. Thus, by the 1090s, the idea that there could be a holy war, bellum sacrum, waged as an act of Christian charity and penance, had gained currency. War to protect Christendom's people or holy sites was portrayed not as sin, but as vindicta caritatis, vengeance carried out through love, to quote the reforming Bishop Anselm of Lucca's phrasing. The paradox of loving vengeance captures the mindset. The violence of war was acceptable, even commendable, if done out of love for one's neighbor and zeal for justice under God. All these threads came together spectacularly at Clermont in November 1095. Pope Urban II's preaching of the First Crusade, though the term crusade would only be adopted later, synthesized pilgrimage, penance, and holy war. According to eyewitness accounts and later chronicles, Urban depicted the plight of Eastern Christians in dire terms and appealed to his Frankish audience's sense of Christian brotherhood and honor. He urged that it was God's will, Deus vult, for the faithful to fight in defense of their fellow Christians and to liberate the holy places defiled by infidels. Two concrete incentives were proclaimed in the council's decrees. One canon renewed the peace of God, again forbidding violence against the innocent at home, and another granted a plenary indulgence to everyone who undertook the armed pilgrimage to the East. This indulgence was truly extraordinary. It promised the complete remission of all temporal punishment due for sin, effectively a spiritual clean slate, to those who, having confessed their sins, went and fought for Christ. In medieval theology, such an indulgence meant that a knight who died on the campaign could bypass the punishments of purgatory. In popular understanding, it equated to an assurance of salvation for those who took the cross sincerely. Urban II thus offered warriors a spiritual exchange. Lay down the sword against your Christian neighbor, take it up against the infidel, and your soul will reap eternal reward. The enthusiastic response at Clermont was unprecedented. A great cry of "God wills it" rose from the crowd, and men of all ranks eagerly affixed cloth crosses to their garments, committing to the journey. One chronicler reports that people ran forward on the spot to take vows, another that bishops immediately began leading contingents from their regions. It is clear that Urban struck a chord. As the Britannica summarizes, By this moment, Western Europe had attained as never before a popular religious fervor, one not without marked eschatological tendencies, centered on Jerusalem, at the same time as war against the infidel had come to be seen as a holy work, and the papacy had the institutional means to orchestrate such an enterprise. How did contemporaries interpret this new crusading ideal? We have at our disposal a rich array of sources, sermons, letters, chronicles, and later memoirs by the Crusaders themselves. Many participants indeed conceived of the expedition in spiritual and even apocalyptic terms. The anonymous author of the Gesta Francorum, Deeds of the Franks, one of the earliest accounts of the First Crusade written by a participant, describes the crusade as a great movement of penitence. A great multitude moved by God undertook to journey to Christ's sepulchre. In one passage cited by historian J. Rubinstein, the Gesta portrays how anyone who zealously wished, with a pure heart and mind, to follow God and wanted faithfully to bear his cross, did not hesitate to take the road to the Holy Sepulchre. This language suggests that the Crusaders saw themselves as pilgrims of an especially intense sort, bearing the cross of Christ literally on their shoulders, in the form of the cloth cross sewn on their clothes, and figuratively in accepting suffering for him. Rubinstein interprets this as an eschatological desire. Many Europeans long to be present in Jerusalem, the center of the world, at history's climax. In medieval maps and imagination, Jerusalem was the spiritual omphalos, the navel of the world. It was widely believed that events there had global significance, and that ultimately Jerusalem would be the stage on which Christ's second coming and the final battle against Antichrist unfold. Thus, to liberate the earthly Jerusalem from the heathen and to be there in person was, for some Crusaders, to participate in the unfolding of God's end-time plan. One can sense an almost literal enactment of the old legend. The king of the Franks, in this case the collective leadership of Frankish nobles, leading the faithful to Jerusalem to await Christ, precisely as late 11th century prophecies about the last emperor foretold. Indeed, several chroniclers and documents from the First Crusade era echo apocalyptic themes. They speak of Jerusalem as the heavenly city and sometimes liken the Saracens, Muslims, to the forces of Gog and Magog, or to the armies of the Antichrist. For example, chronicler Fulcher of Chartres, in his history, marvels that people of all tongues flocked to Jerusalem after its liberation in 1099, implicitly likening it to biblical prophecies, such as Isaiah's vision of all nations coming to Mount Zion in the last days. Another cleric, Guibert of Nogent, writing shortly after the Crusade, gave his account the title De Gesta per Francos, the deeds of God through the Franks, a title that itself suggests a providential, quasi-biblical mission. Guibert explicitly connects the crusading warriors with the soldiers of the apocalypse, described in Revelation, who fight the beast. He stops short of saying the end is at hand, but he clearly wants to frame the Crusaders' feats in cosmic and of history significance. In the Crusade preaching of the subsequent decades, for instance, Saint Bernard of Clairvaux's eloquent calls for the Second Crusade in 1146, one finds recurring references to eschatological motifs. Bernard called Crusaders athletes of God, and in one sermon suggested that their struggle against the infidel was part of the preparation for Christ's kingdom, language resonant with apocalyptic holy war imagery. Not all who took the cross were steeped in apocalyptic lore, of course. For many knights, the crusade ideal was understood primarily in terms of penance and honor. It was a feudal duty transposed to a sacred register. They followed their lord, ultimately Christ and his vicar, the Pope, in battle, seeking glory and the reward of salvation. But even this chivalric interpretation could slide into an eschatological one, since the concept of Christian knighthood carried a sense of divine mission that easily merged with end-time battles between good and evil. The Song of Roland, an old French epic popular in the age of the Crusades, depicts Charlemagne's war in Spain as an apocalyptic showdown with the forces of Saracen darkness, complete with angelic interventions, reflecting how the lay warrior culture absorbed biblical war imagery. One must also mention the darker side of crusading enthusiasm. Episodes like the Rhineland massacres of 1096, where mobs of crusaders, notably under Count Emico of Leiningen, attacked Jewish communities en route to the east. Chroniclers report that some of these perpetrators were motivated by twisted apocalyptic reasoning. They argued that before facing Christ's enemies abroad, they should eliminate Christ's enemies at home, identifying the Jews as blasphemers and agents of Antichrist. There was even a distorted belief circulating that Jews might be allied with the Muslim Caliph in a conspiracy against Christians, or that converting or killing the Jews would accelerate the Second Coming. Count Emicho himself was enveloped in legends. One account suggested he believed he was destined to become a king in Jerusalem, perhaps even the last emperor. Although historians debate the extent to which Emicho and the so-called People's Crusade, led by Peter the Hermit, were truly millenarian movements, there is evidence that apocalyptic expectation played a role. These early unsanctioned bands saw heavenly signs. For instance, an apparition of a cross in the sky was reported, and took them as divine endorsement of their cause, fueling a sense that the end of days was at hand, and they were its instruments. Such incidents illustrate how the crusading ideal, when embraced outside the discipline of church authority, could become radicalized and lead to atrocities, all under the delusion of fulfilling prophecy. In interpreting the crusading phenomenon, modern historians have grappled with how central or peripheral apocalyptic thought was to its inception and conduct. Until recently, many viewed the First Crusade primarily through the lens of pilgrimage and penance, emphasizing the practical piety and devotional goals of the Crusaders: to rescue Eastern Christians, to atone for sin, to visit the holy sites. Economic or social explanations were also offered, e.g., younger sons seeking land and fortune, or Europe exporting a surplus of quarrelsome knights. However, more recent scholarship has given greater due to the ideological and apocalyptic dimension. Historian J. Rubenstein, for example, argues that the story of the apocalypse fundamentally shaped how people of the time understood the First Crusade. He notes that nearly every contemporary chronicle of the Crusade is suffused with apocalyptic imagery once you look for it. From meteors streaking the sky in 1095, seen as stars falling from heaven, as in Matthew 24, to the identification of the Crusaders' Muslim foes with ancient Gog and Magog, the participants interpreted their experience within the framework of biblical prophecy. This does not mean they expected Christ to descend in a cloud the moment they took Jerusalem in 1099, though a few may have harbored such hopes. It does mean that the Crusade was imagined as a world historical event in the divine script, a prelude to the ultimate victory of God's kingdom.
The origins of the crusading ideal, then, are to be found in this potent mix of influences: the penitential pilgrim ethos, the just war tradition, the peace of God reform spirit, and the latent apocalyptic narrative of a climactic struggle for Jerusalem. Urban II's genius was to weave these strands into a single call to action. The interpretations of Crusade at the time reflected that synthesis. To church leaders like Urban, the Crusade was a sanctioned holy expedition that would strengthen Christian unity, exalt the church, and perhaps even heal the schism with the East. To many knights, it was an adventure of sanctified valor and a chance to earn eternal merit. To many common folk, it could appear as the onset of the long-foretold final crusade against the enemies of Christ, leading the way to salvation and the New Jerusalem. In the aftermath of the First Crusade's astonishing success, the capture of Jerusalem in July 1099, there was a sense of vindication, proof that God blessed the endeavor. A frank letter from the Crusade leaders to Pope Urban, written in September 1099, exulted that our Lord Jesus Christ has repaid us with victory and implored the Pope to come to Jerusalem to witness the glory of God's work. Some modern scholars detect in this letter an implicit urging that Urban make haste to the Holy City, perhaps to preside there as the last emperor or new patriarch in the end times. Urban II, however, died in 1099 before even hearing that Jerusalem had been taken. The Crusaders established the Kingdom of Jerusalem, a Latin Christian realm in the Levant, which they no doubt saw as part of God's plan. For a time, it might have seemed to them that the apocalyptic saga was advancing. Christ's patrimony on earth was expanding. The infidel had been dealt a mighty blow, and the Holy Sepulchre was restored to Christian worship. Yet history went on. The definitive end did not arrive, and within less than 50 years, new Islamic forces, under Saladin, would retake Jerusalem, prompting further crusades. Looking at the broader interpretations of the crusading ideal over time, one finds a spectrum. Medieval commentators of the 12th and 13th centuries increasingly spiritualized the meaning of crusade or tied it to apocalyptic chronology. For instance, some later theorists thought the Crusades were delaying Antichrist by holding back Islamic power, thus acting as the katechon, the force which restrains mentioned in 2 Thessalonians 2:7. Modern historians have debated whether the Crusades were primarily driven by faith or by worldly factors. The consensus in recent decades underscores the sincerity of Crusaders' religious motives. The concept of indulgence and penitential warfare was genuinely believed by participants. Moreover, as this book will explore, the crusading enterprise cannot be separated from the eschatological outlook of the age. The crusading ideal was, at its heart, an ideal of Christendom united in arms, preparing the way for God's ultimate triumph.
1.4. Rationale and structure of the book. The present book, Apocalyptic Eschatology and the Crusading Ideal in 11th century Europe, seeks to investigate the dynamic interplay between end-times expectation and the ethos of holy war in one of medieval Europe's most pivotal periods. The central thesis driving our inquiry is that apocalyptic eschatology was not a fringe or incidental aspect of the First Crusade era, but rather a significant and perhaps indispensable element of its ideological fabric. By examining contemporary mentalities, textual evidence, and historical events, we aim to shed light on how the imagination of the apocalypse influenced the launch of the crusading movement, and conversely, how the experience of the crusade fed back into apocalyptic thought. Several considerations underlie the rationale for this study. First, as noted in the introduction above, recent scholarship, such as the work of J. Rubinstein and others, has illuminated the apocalyptic dimensions of the First Crusade in new depth, arguing that previous historians underappreciated this facet. By bringing together analysis of both the theological currents, e.g., the legacy of Augustine, the development of prophetic legends, the Gregorian reform ideology, and the popular religiosity, signs, wonders, and hopes recorded around 1095 to 1099, this book hopes to provide a more holistic understanding of why the First Crusade erupted when it did and captured the medieval imagination so powerfully. Second, the study of apocalyptic beliefs offers a window into the medieval mindset, the hopes and fears of ordinary believers and churchmen alike. Eschatology is, in a sense, the archaeology of a culture's ultimate concerns. By exploring apocalyptic motifs, we come to see how 11th century Europeans perceived their place in history, whether they stood at the threshold of the last days, whether their struggles were invested with cosmic significance, and how they coped with the tension between expectation and reality. Third, this topic has relevance for understanding the broader narrative of the Middle Ages. The crusading movement did not end with the 11th century. It evolved over the 12th and 13th centuries, intersecting again and again with apocalyptic ideas. From the euphoric preachings that preceded the Second Crusade, to the prophetic utopianism surrounding figures like Joachim of Fiore in the Third Crusade era, to the dark apocalyptic despair following the disasters of the later Crusades. Thus, by focusing on the formative 11th century phase, the book lays groundwork for comprehending later developments in medieval eschatology and holy war. The structure of the book is designed to develop the argument step by step, balancing narrative chronology with thematic analysis. Although the titles of the chapters are different than that provided below, the theme is the same. Chapter 1, Introduction, the present chapter, has set the stage with an overview of the historical context, definitions of key terms, and the overarching goals of the study. It outlines how Europe's 11th century milieu was conducive to an alliance between apocalyptic enthusiasm and the crusading ideal, and it poses the central questions to be explored. Chapter 2. The Legacy of Augustine and the Early Medieval Eschatological Imagination will delve deeper into the intellectual inheritance of the Latin West regarding the end times. We will examine primary sources from church fathers, like Augustine, Gregory the Great, etc., and early medieval commentators to understand the official eschatology that shaped clerical thought up to the 11th century. Special attention will be given to how this legacy coexisted with popular apocalyptic expectations. We will also consider the development of key legends, such as the Last Emperor and the Signs of Antichrist, tracing how these filtered into 11th century thought. Chapter 3, Portents and Prophecies Around the Millennium, focuses on the transitional period of the late 10th and early 11th centuries. Here we will scrutinize events like the Peace of God movement, the response to the approach of the year 1000 and 1033, and case studies of local panic or preparation, e.g. the Chronicle of Rodulfus Glaber, the homilies of Wulfstan, Adamar of Shaban's testimony from Aquitaine, etc. The aim is to paint a nuanced portrait of medieval millennialism in action, identifying what was myth and what was reality about the so-called terrors of the year 1000, and showing how apocalyptic rhetoric was used to spur moral reform. For instance, how the Peace of God councils invoke divine wrath to scare knights straight. This sets a direct precedent for the moral religious environment in which the Crusade call would resonate. Chapter 4, Holy War and Holy Peace, the Reform Papacy's Ideology, will examine the Church's internal evolution in the decades before the First Crusade. We will analyze documents from reformist churchmen, letters of Gregory VII, the Acts of Church Councils, and writings of influential figures like Anselm of Lucca and Pope Urban II himself, to uncover the theological justification of military endeavors by the sanctified authority. We will trace the incremental steps, from blessing defensive wars to promising spiritual rewards for fighting infidels in Spain, to Gregory's crusading prototype plan, and finally to the conceptual breakthrough of Urban's indulgence. Throughout, we will highlight how reformers couch these innovations in biblical language and sometimes in apocalyptic imagery. For example, seeing the Turks as Gog and Magog, or likening the liberation of Jerusalem to preparing the bride of Christ for his return. The Council of Clermont will be revisited in detail, using the various chronicles of Urban's speech to piece together its themes and appeals. Chapter 5, God Wills It, Apocalyptic Themes in First Crusade Narratives. This chapter constitutes a close reading of the chronicles and letters from the First Crusade, 1096 to 1099. It will explore how the participants describe their motives and experiences. We will examine the Gesta Francorum, Raymond of Aguilar's Chronicle, Fulcher of Chartres, the letters of leaders like Stephen of Blois and the princes to the Pope, and later reflections by authors such as Guibert of Nogent and Eckhard of Ora. The goal is to extract and analyze references to prophecy, scripture, and eschatology. For instance, reports of visions, like the vision of Christ and the army of saints at Antioch, the discovery of the Holy Lance and its apocalyptic resonance, the role of preachers like Peter the Hermit in stoking millennial hopes among the masses, and the interpretation of major victories in providential terms. We will also discuss the massacres of Jews in 1096 as a tragic manifestation of misdirected apocalyptic zeal. Through these sources, we will see the range of apocalyptic interpretation, from moderate crusaders as new Maccabees or Israelites, to extreme crusaders as agents of the imminent last days. Chapter 6, Triumph and Disappointment, Eschatology in the Wake of Victory, addresses the immediate aftermath of the First Crusade. How did the capture of Jerusalem reshape or fulfill apocalyptic expectations? Did crusaders believe they had triggered the end times, or that they had simply performed a great act of piety within history? We will consider evidence that some thought the mission essentially complete, Christendom had been expanded, they could await Christ's return in peace, versus evidence that others saw it as only the beginning of ongoing struggle. The establishment of permanent Latin states in the East, a mundane political development, had to be squared with any lingering hopes of an imminent apocalypse. We'll look at sources like the early 12th century letters in the chronicles of Orderic Vitalis and William of Malmesbury for retrospective insight. There is also the intriguing case of the so-called Peace of 1100, an idea that after Jerusalem's liberation, a period of concord prevailed, likely more literary trope than reality. This chapter will act as a pivot to understand how eschatological enthusiasm was modulated once the initial Crusade enthusiasm settled. Chapter 7. The Crusading Apocalypse in Perspective. In the concluding chapter, we will step back and evaluate the findings, considering the longer-term implications. We will trace how the themes from the 11th century carried into the 12th and 13th. For example, the rise of Joachite apocalypticism during the Second and Third Crusades, Joachim, of Fiore's theories and their influence on Crusade-minded circles, and the persistent idea of a last world emperor now sometimes applied to figures like Emperor Frederick II or St. Louis. We will assess whether the First Crusade should be seen as a unique moment of apocalyptic enthusiasm or as part of a continuum of medieval apocalyptic movements. Finally, we will reflect on what this interweaving of apocalyptic eschatology and crusading ideal tells us about medieval Christian thought, its flexibility, its power to mobilize society, and its capacity for both lofty spiritual vision and grievous moral lapses, as seen in anti-Jewish violence. Throughout the book, a conscious effort is made to integrate primary sources, in translation, to let medieval voices be heard, alongside the interpretations of modern historians. Each chapter combines narrative with analysis, aiming for a style that is rigorous enough for scholars, but accessible to students and general readers interested in the medieval mind. The tone as set out in this introduction is narrative academic. We weave the story of events with the thread of ideas, always grounding assertions in evidence and scholarship. In conclusion, this book argues that to fully understand the Crusade phenomenon, one must appreciate its eschatological dimension. The men and women of 1095 to 1099 lived not only in a physical landscape of feudal lordships and pilgrim roads, but also in a mental landscape populated by angels and devils, signs and portents, prophetic promises, and apocalyptic anxieties. The crusading ideal gave them a concrete course of action. Apocalyptic eschatology gave that action an ultimate meaning. As we proceed, we will see how the intersection of these two forces created a defining moment in the history of Europe and of Christianity, a moment whose echoes would resound for centuries to come.